1,000 years ago, this valley was the home of the Anasazi Indians. The Anasazi were fabulously wealthy. They imported food. They developed advanced technologies. They constructed these sophisticated and technologically complex 4-story high buildings. The Anasazi had it all. Yet, only a few hundred years after reaching the peak of their success, the society completely collapsed, leaving behind a ghost city and the unanswerable question, what went wrong? This is a story that has been repeated since the birth of civilization. Egypt, Rome, and more recently, the Soviet Union. Not just human societies follow this pattern of emerging from chaos, prospering and becoming stable, then suddenly disintegrating. Whole species, such as the dinosaurs, followed the same pattern. And seemingly the pattern is repeated everywhere. Planets and stars are formed from a mess of chaotically moving atoms. Order and stability seem to be imposed until finally, and usually catastrophically, chaos reigns once again. It's been the ambition of scientists for the last 5,000 years to try and understand this sort of basic pattern which underlies nature and human life. They've been successful in explaining, predicting, and even controlling relatively simple phenomena, but they cannot predict the weather or the next earthquake or the next extinction, which might be ours. Recently, scientists came up with a theory of chaos. It explains how unpredictable outcomes arise from seemingly simple rules. Now some researchers claim to have found a revolutionary new theory. It explains how order arises from chaos, and they've called this new science anti-chaos. And it could overturn most of present scientific thinking. Fish, swimming around in a haphazard fashion, can, in an instant, change to a school which behaves as one entity. When hundreds of birds rise into the air, they do so as individuals, flapping their wings out of rhythm with the bird next to them. Yet rapidly, this random motion of bodies and wings coalesces into a graceful formation. A flock of birds can swoop and wheel about as if directed by a single mind. High-speed film reveals that the turning motion travels through the flock as a wave in about 1/70th of a second, far less than a bird's reaction time. How do the messages turn left, turn right, pass through the group? Telepathy has been suggested, but a supernatural explanation is unnecessary. Mathematicians have discovered that order can arise spontaneously from the interaction of many simple individuals. Each of these computer simulations, called voids, follows its own simple rules of behavior. Yet surprisingly, the group flocks as in real life. A pattern has arisen from disorder. Patterns and structures are everywhere, in nature and in society. They appear in the arrangement of atoms to form crystals, or the collective behavior of ants, in the way species evolve and become extinct, and even the rises and falls of financial markets. But it's beyond the power of traditional science to explain or predict these phenomena. When structure emerges from chaos, that breaks one of the cornerstones of modern science, the Second Law of Thermodynamics. There's considerable evidence to support the second law. It explains how things such as plants decay with time. From the highly ordered structure of a plant's cells, we pass to stages of increasing disorder, or what's called increasing entropy. The greater the disorder, the more the original form disappears. In the extreme, this means that the order of the universe as we know it, with steadily burning stars and organized lumps of matter called planets, will eventually disintegrate. When all the energy is dissipated, everything will cease and all structure will vanish in the heat death of the universe. That is, according to the second law of thermodynamics. Yet this is not what we find. Somehow, as the universe moves towards its inevitable end, it continually creates interesting structures along the way. Scientists who rely on the second law find it impossible to explain the process. Those who study anti-chaos and are formulating the new science of complexity hope to explain how order arises from chaos.
If there's any one big question that complexity is trying to address, it's why is there something rather than nothing? In some ways, that's the ultimate question in science. Physicists for well over 100 years have been very good at understanding the universal tendency towards disorder and decay. It's often called the second law of thermodynamics, the increase in entropy. We look around and we can see very clearly that things decay, that iron rusts, that fallen logs rot, that temperature goes from hot to cold, things cool off. But at the same time, not only do fallen logs rot, but trees grow. If we look around, we see stars, galaxies, people, plants, animals. There's enormous amounts of structure in the world. It's almost as if there were a universal yearning towards order, almost a force towards order.
This could mean the second law of thermodynamics is wrong. It could mean, as some people claim, that physicists have proved that life can't exist. It could mean that, since life does exist, that something supernatural must be involved. My feeling is it's the interpretation of the second law of thermodynamics that's wrong, and that life is actually consistent with the second law, but that the kind of things it's doing are just not the sort of things the second law addresses.
Another fundamental law is Isaac Newton's law of gravity, discovered in 1684. At first, scientists thought it would reveal many secrets of the universe. It accurately predicted the motions of all heavenly bodies, and was followed only 3 years later by his famous laws of motion. It was thought then that using these tools it would only be a matter of time before the whole universe could be explained. These ideals have driven scientists to try and find simple laws underlying even the most complicated phenomena. Such laws became the basis of all scientific method, and they have been very productive. Biologists dug deep into cells at a molecular level and found the double helix, the code of life itself. Physicists smashed atoms apart to discover the particles produced by the Big Bang, the building blocks of the entire universe. But in the process, they discovered something strange. Their laws weren't good enough. Newtonian laws can explain what we call linear systems. For a given cause, there is always a predictable outcome. That is not true, however, for complex systems. The behavior, for instance, of water molecules, which, when gathered in huge numbers and subjected to heat and pressure, create a very unpredictable system. We call it the weather. This type of behavior has been dubbed emergent.
You have an emergent phenomenon when the components out of which a system is made have one kind of behavior, but the system as a whole shows a different kind of behavior, so that you cannot reduce the behavior of the whole system to the behavior of the individual components. In other words, you have a kind of irreducibility, and emergence refers to that kind of irreducible order that comes out of a complex system.
Look at an individual water molecule. Its behavior in liquid water gives us few clues as to how the same molecule will behave when heated to form vapor, or when it's cooled to form ice crystals.
The idea of emergence, of course, has been around for a long time. We've known about it since we've known about hurricanes, I guess. Perhaps before that. What is new in the science of complexity, what caused it to come out in the last 10 years or so, is several things. One is that starting in the 1970s, scientists had much more access to powerful computers and could begin to model complicated systems and see what kinds of behaviors they engaged in, often not at all obvious from the equations that they fed into the computers. Another thing that happened was the spectacular success of molecular biology, where a biologist went in, dissected out, and looked at the individual molecules that were the basis of life and began to appreciate that the essence of life was the organization of those molecules, how they interacted with each other in a very dynamic, collective way. And then, of course, the understanding of the mathematics of nonlinear equations and chaos had a profound impact also.
Chaos is the name given to systems which appear to behave randomly, yet can be analyzed mathematically. The intricately beautiful shape of a fractal is the image of chaos at work. Its complex structure, repeating itself on infinitely diminishing scales, is created on the computer from the simplest of rules. The discovery that complex behavior can come from simple rules is at the heart of chaos.
The kind of thing where you can see chaos in action is a food mixer in the kitchen. The actual rules of a food mixer are very simple. You put the food in, you push the button, and little paddle wheels go round and round and round in circles. And you say, well, there's nothing very complicated about a food mixer. But actually there is. If somebody says, there is a particular grain of sugar in that food mixer, I'm going to press the button for 30 seconds and I want you to tell me where that grain is going to end up. It's very hard to answer that question. And this is the kind of prediction that science would expect to make.
Chaotic systems are everywhere, from the fracturing of water drops falling to the ground to the behavior of larger bodies of water in the turbulent motion of a stream. But chaos is not randomness, it has form. Understanding chaos is to begin to understand the underlying nature of complex systems.
Chaos is one piece of the theory of complexity. In a sense, it's the first piece people really understood fairly well. And it's because, in fact, it comes from simple causes. If the causes are simple, you can put them on a computer, you can follow through what happens, and you can see, even if the results look complicated, you know where they came from. It's the other way around that's much more difficult. If the causes are very complicated, then you can't even get started.
While chaotic systems create ever-increasing complexity and unpredictability, others behave in exactly the opposite way. Some quite disordered systems spontaneously crystallize into a high degree of order. This is the influence of anti-chaos. The Belousov-Zhabotinsky experiment shows how order spontaneously arises in a chemical process. 4 chemicals are mixed together. Gradually, concentric waves of red and blue separate out, in complete contrast with the expected random mixing of molecules. Such a degree of order stemming from the activity of billions of molecules seems incredible, but the process is not only observed in the laboratory. A similar pattern occurs in the reproductive process of one simple organism, when individual cells swarm together almost as if acting under orders to form a combined entity called slime mold. Striking patterns appear in the arrangement of molecules on a platinum catalyst. That the patterns can be found in so many different systems implies that, at the most fundamental level, universal principles of organization are at work, from computer simulations of forest fires to the behavior of ants.
Now, for some time, it has occurred to a lot of scientists that ant colonies and the social insects generally have fascinating dynamic patterns of behavior that are somewhat reminiscent of the way minds behave. In other words, you have all these simple elements, the ants, running about, doing their own thing, and out of that comes a particular kind of order. It's like neurons interacting, doing very simple things in the brain, but if you put enough of them together and have them interact in a particular way, you get the most extraordinary type of behavior coming out.
The behavior of individual ants is much more random than that of the colony as a whole. The community follows a regular pattern of activity and inactivity. It appears to have a periodic rhythm of about 28 minutes. But why do all the ants stop and start at the same time? Nothing tells them to. Brian Goodwin turned to a computer model to try and find out.
We tried to produce the simplest possible model that could account for this type of behavior. And so we developed a model in which ants were represented as very simple automata. So they were just interacting, they could move, and what emerged very quickly from this model was the fact that periodicities at the level of the colony suddenly appeared.
The model also showed that without the simple form of interaction between ants, no order emerged. The computer ants are not programmed to act as a unified group. Yet, if they're allowed to wander at will, bump into one another and react, the temporal pattern of activity returns. At first sight, the idea of order emerging from randomness is inherently unlikely. Imagine a system of 26 elements, the letters of the alphabet. Someone, blindfolded and with no knowledge of the keyboard, taps the keys of a typewriter at random. What are the chances of a whole word appearing from the resulting letters? And what are the chances of the letters organizing themselves into, say, a Shakespeare play? Hamlet, for example. Then, if you ran the experiment again, what are the chances of the same play materializing again and again? In nature, this kind of organization can and does occur. Does the theory of anti-chaos tell us why?
I became interested in anti-chaos on an intuitive basis. I wanted to understand the order of development, the way a fertilized egg develops into an adult organism, which is a most amazing process that nobody understands yet. You have to understand that one begins with a fertilized egg, the zygote, and it then goes through 50 or so cell divisions. And during the course of that, cells become different from one another. This is a process called cell differentiation, so that the beginning fertilized egg, the zygote, winds up making about 250 different cell types: muscle cells, nerve cells, spleen cells, kidney cells, and so on. And it's quite clear that all of the cells in your body have the same set of genes, about 100,000 or so in us. Different cells differ because different genes are active in them. Being active means making an RNA molecule and making a protein. So liver cells make one set of proteins and kidney cells another. And one knew even then that genes turned one another on and off in some complex orchestrated dance. Anti-chaos from the outset was my intuition and hope, namely that one would find that the order that you see in development and cell differentiation is spontaneous and natural and rather inevitable, rather than being merely the improbable consequences of mutation and selection. If we want to think of the genome as 100,000 genes in some kind of network turning one another on and off, then there's no mathematical tools readily available to look at a system of that complexity. We're going to have to invent some new ones. The ones that I invented some time ago were based on thinking of a gene as just active or inactive, as if it were a light bulb, and its product molecule just present or absent, so also like a light bulb.
To get an array of light bulbs to behave in a way reminiscent of that which controls our genes, they have to be wired up following simple rules. The resulting network is called a Boolean network. In the most complex version of a Boolean, each light bulb is wired to every other one via a switch which obeys a rule. The rule might be an individual bulb will light only if two others are lit. Incredibly, with even a smaller number of light bulbs as 200, the time it would take to cycle through every possible state of the network is billions of times longer than the age of the universe. So arriving at any given pattern of lighting would be extremely unlikely. Here, bulbs colored green are lighting up randomly, but the few islands of red show where some stability has been achieved. But a Boolean network model of the human genome would have not 200 elements, but 100,000. If it followed these rules, life would probably never have happened. By making a simple change in the way elements are connected, when each light bulb is only wired to two others, things get considerably better. Order and stability emerge.
The most stunning results happen if you build a network in which every light bulb has inputs from two other light bulbs. Even if you assign those connections at random, even if you assign the rule governing every light bulb at random. Such a mad scramble of wiring and logic nevertheless exhibits anti-chaos. This is order for free.
Even if the network has 100,000 light bulbs, then the total possible number of states of the system turns out to be a mere 320 or so, roughly the number of cell types in the human body. Simplifying the connections produces just a tiny number of states of the network or the genome.
And to give you a sense of how tiny it is, we have to count the number of possible states that your genome could be in. If each gene could be active or inactive, and there's 100,000 genes, the number of possible alternative patterns of any genome in your body, in any one of your cells, is 1 followed by 30,000 zeros. It's an enormous, hyper-astronomical, unthinkable number. Anti-chaos says that a system of that kind, despite that vast complexity, boxes its behavior into a tiny, tiny, tiny region of its space of possibilities and cycles through them. That's the order that's pointed to when one says anti-chaos.
In the same way that a network of light bulbs can represent certain aspects of the behavior of the human genome, more dynamic complex systems can be modeled and studied by watching piles of sand form.
The sand pile model is a model of a large dynamical system which consists of many parts. Suppose you build the sand pile by dropping grains of sand one at a time on your desk. In the beginning, the pile will be flat and it will be near equilibrium. All the grains of sand will be lying very low and they won't see each other, they won't interact with each other. As you keep adding particles to the system, the heap will become steeper and steeper, and you will start getting small avalanches in the system. That means that the individual parts of the system start interacting with each other. And eventually, the avalanches will become bigger and bigger and bigger until you reach a critical slope where the system will not grow any further. And at that state, you have avalanches of all sizes. That means that the system interacts globally. What happens at one part of the heap can eventually affect what happens at any other part of the heap. We don't have separate grains of sand anymore. We don't have many distinct systems. We have only one pile of sand that form one big dynamical system.
Such systems are all around us. The extremes of the weather, the extinction of species, wild fluctuations of currency markets, and many other phenomena.
Down to 30, Jeremy!
Think of earthquakes as being generated by pushing tectonic plates into each other. In the beginning, the system is at equilibrium, just as the sand pile is in equilibrium in the flat state. But eventually, as the tectonic plates keeps squeezing into each other, you get into a state that is further and further and further out of equilibrium. And again, the earthquakes then will become bigger and bigger and bigger because the forces will become bigger and bigger and bigger. And the law for the sand slides in the sand slide models is exactly equivalent to what is called the Gutenberg-Richter law for earthquakes. Namely, that every time you have, say, one earthquake of size 6, you have 10 earthquakes of size 5, and 100 earthquakes of size 4, and so on. And the sand pile model exhibits precisely this feature. So that gives an understanding of why we have this very peculiar law for earthquakes. Actually, what it means is that the crust of the earth on which we are walking is at what we call a critical stage. It's precisely as this sand pile when it's at this state where it can grow no further. So this is completely different from the usual picture that people have of what's going on around us, namely that we think of things as being in some kind of equilibrium, but nothing could be further from the truth.
If this view of nature is correct, then we're not living in a nice, stable, gently evolving world and universe as we once thought. Instead, we're part of a system which is just balanced between order and disorder. Anti-chaos, nature's yearning for order, is counteracted by chaos. Understanding the rules of chaos and anti-chaos may finally be leading us to a clear view of the complex environment we live in and create. Manipulating the rules of complexity might offer a glimpse of the future and may one day permit us to control our own destiny. From the equations of anti-chaos, new life forms are stirring. Working from just a few simple principles, a rich variety of extraordinary forms spring spontaneously from the ground. They compete for space and evolve. A stable environment is created. As the rules of anti-chaos are observed, order arrives.
Perhaps the most profound problem in biology is how life itself started. Of course, nobody knows. There really are two broad views. One is that life is based on the special properties of the magical double helix that everyone knows about, either DNA molecules or RNA molecules. What I've wanted to find myself for years is a deeper grounds to think that life is, in a sense, an absolutely expected property of complex chemical systems. I want it to be the case, if you will, that we're at home in the universe, that life is spontaneous, natural, and almost inevitable. And I think that that's the case.
There is some proof that life inevitably emerged from the primordial seas of Earth 4 million years ago. If the basic chemicals in the sea are subjected to a violent electrical discharge, such as lightning, the result is a set of fundamental compounds, the chemical building blocks of all living things. Anti-chaos suggests that this is no accident. It's inevitable that individual chemicals will cluster together and organize themselves into more complex ones.
Let's imagine the buildup and behavior of the imagined primordial soup. Life emerged about 3.8 billion years ago, just 100 million years after the crust was cool enough to support liquid water. So we have to imagine that there were some organic molecules around, carbon, methane, and so on, carbon dioxide, methane, and so on, that were gradually built up into more complex kinds of organic molecules, creating this hoped-for primordial soup.
Kaufmann's theory involves the well-known chemical principle of catalysis, in which the catalyst persuades two molecules to combine more readily than if left to their own devices. Many of the functions of living organisms depend on this process. But in the primordial soup, this process alone is not enough to explain how all the necessary ingredients for life were formed. Stuart Kaufmann's come up with the idea of autocatalytic sets. In this process, catalysis takes place to produce a chemical which then combines with another to produce yet another sort of molecule, and so on, until the correct chemicals are present to make some more of the catalyst. Autocatalysis is a self-reinforcing reaction.
If in fact life emerged as such collective autocatalytic sets of molecules, then it would appear to be the case that the roots to the formation of life are much more probable than we've expected. So we might hope to find it, for example, on other promising planets and other solar systems. In effect, life is the consequence of broad boulevards of possibility, not back alleys of thermodynamic improbability.
The potential for life to order itself spontaneously doesn't, however, automatically explain everything. For instance, how did life, once formed, then evolve into relatively few distinct groups of organisms, each sharing many common features? There's been a very strong underlying pattern to all of evolution.
The question is, where does that order come from? Now, in the conventional view, that order is basically imposed by historical succession and by natural selection. So you have a process in which virtually anything is possible. You get random variations, and those structures which are useful, like the eye or the limb, the leaf, the flower, they are stabilized by natural selection.
In other words, the Darwinian view. But if evolution is seen as a complex system in which order spontaneously arises from randomness, then the concept of natural selection becomes redundant.
What we see as the origin of this order, the eye, the leaf, the limb, whatever it may be, is the intrinsic dynamics of developing organisms as complex dynamic systems. And therefore, the emphasis is shifted from natural selection as an external force to the robust dynamics of development as the generator of these forms. For instance, the eye we see as a highly probable structure, something that once you understand the principles of development in vertebrates, you realize that eyes are virtually inevitable.
Studying artificial life, such as this computer-generated amoeba, is starting to suggest that Charles Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection is at best incomplete. In fact, it may be too complicated. A set of very simple rules might well be enough to explain how complex life forms, real or artificial, come into existence.
One of the things that we've learned in the last decade or so of the study of complex systems is that the most interesting complex behavior comes out of not incredibly complicated systems, but out of systems which are composed of relatively simple parts, but many of them that interact with each other in fairly simple ways even. As a consequence, many of our formal models, the mathematical and computer models that we use to study complex systems, involve simulating or treating mathematically very, very simple parts that interact with each other in the context of some environment. And one of the systems that's been used the most is something called a cellular automaton.
Cellular automata consist of a grid of tiny squares. The action of any one of them is dependent on the action of the adjoining squares. This system of replicating loops is built up from a series of very simple rules programmed into each cell. Once a loop has surrounded itself with copies, there's no longer any space for it to reproduce, and it dies.
As the process of reproduction continues, one ends up with an expanding colony of loops that's spread out throughout this two-dimensional cellular automaton universe, consisting of a growing reproductive fringe surrounding an ever-expanding core or central region of dead loops. But it was surprising that what I ended up with was something which is very reminiscent of the growth of, say, a tree, where the central core of the tree consists of dead cells, and only the bark and the layer right under the bark is alive, growing out and expanding. Or, for instance, the growth of a coral reef, where the outermost surface consists of living animals that are building their shells upon the shells of their dead ancestors.
But is it life in all its color and richness? Hardly. By studying the animals and plants of the rainforests, it's been possible to create a whole universe inside a computer. In the artificial environment, digital life forms behave just like creatures of flesh and blood. The inhabitants of Tierra live by only two rules: reproduce and mutate.
Well, I started studying the computer as if I were an ecologist, looking at the computer as an environment that could be inhabited by life. And I thought about what are the resources that these digital organisms would need, and I came to think of the computer's memory as the space that they would live in, and the central processing time as the analog of energy that would drive the organisms. So I wrote a computer program that could reproduce itself. and I designed a special computer for it to live in, and I would run this self-reproducing program in a computer that would mutate the programs. It would mutate it by flipping bits, so that the offspring programs wouldn't always be like the parent.
The first creature to populate this world is red. It evolves from the primordial soup of the computer memory. As it does so, it occasionally mutates, so that a new kind of creature is created. If the mutation makes beings that breed faster than the original red creature, they start to take over this universe.
Surprisingly, even in this digital world, many things occur that are recognizable, or I recognize from having worked in the rainforest. Right away, things appear that take advantage of the original program. These are parasites. They borrow information from the original program. And once the parasites become very common, then other things come along that take advantage of the parasites. They steal their energy. So we see a long succession of forms where whatever is successful becomes a target for some new form of parasite that takes advantage of it.
All of this complex behavior results from just two simple instructions: reproduce and mutate. As time passes in the computer universe, the creatures learn to trust one another, and, almost predictably, others then cheat on the society. This is disturbingly close to the way most life forms have evolved.
Well, I consider this to be real evolution. The only thing that's not real is the medium that it's evolving in. But one thing we can learn from that is that regardless of what the medium is, whether it's the chemistry of carbon and hydrogen or the chemistry of bits, we still get the same sort of processes. The life process itself takes on these forms.
In Tierra, moreover, the patterns of the digital extinctions match those in the real world, as displayed in the fossil record. They also follow the overall patterns of Pairback's sand piles. The arrival of a new creature is like the addition of another grain of sand to the pile. When there are too many animals, there's an extinction. Too many sand grains, there's an avalanche. As new animals or grains are arriving, the system is delicately balanced on the edge of chaos. Many natural systems are similarly poised.
The most complex behavior that we observe in both the physical systems that we see in nature and also in the systems that we study in computers seem to occur at a point which we call the edge of chaos. It's a point when these systems are sort of just melting from a very ordered frozen regime to a disordered or random regime. Right at the transition point between the two is where we see them exhibiting their most complex behavior.
Understanding the junction between order and disorder might, for instance, allow us to explain for the first time how once dominant economies can slip into decline and fall. It might help us comprehend the sometimes bizarre behavior of the stock market.
20 at 4.
Or understand how currencies can fluctuate wildly and seemingly randomly. Conventional economic theories cannot explain these events. The boundaries of anti-chaos might be able to.
When you start to think from a complexity point of view, you begin to see the economy not as something that's static, that's reached an equilibrium, that's basically, in a sense, dead. The economy you begin to see as something that's always unfolding, it's always reforming new patterns. It's forming into, think of the cities out there, they're forming patterns of settlement. Those patterns form and reform over decades and centuries. So we're starting to view the economy not as a sort of static system that one can sort of study through a microscope like a dead specimen in a lab, but we're starting to see it almost as alive, something that's always unfolding, that's always changing, that is, in a sense, always evolving. And this point of view is starting to make us look at the economy very much as an evolving, complex system rather than a simple, static system.
An example of how unpredictable markets can be was the battle between the two domestic video recorder systems in the late 1970s. Betamax was technologically slightly superior to VHS, yet surprisingly, VHS sales started to outstrip those of Betamax. Traditional economics predicts that the Betamax system should then have enjoyed increased demand, more sales, and the market would have been pulled back into equilibrium. This did not happen. In other words, there was an outcome to the situation that classical theory couldn't predict.
When I realized that in economics you could have more than one solution to the same problem, this absolutely horrified me. And it horrified a lot of my colleagues and some of my former professors even. We were used to thinking in economics that there was only one solution to any given economic problem. At least that was the dominant mode of thinking. And that solution in some way we could prove was the best of all feasible worlds. That is, that this solution that you see out there that the economy has arrived at is the best of all feasible worlds that England could do at the moment. Yet, here was I and other people thinking this way, showing that for any given economic problem, there might be more than one solution. There might be 2 solutions, there might be 100 solutions, there might be infinite number of solutions. And that would mean, and this was the real horror of the whole thing, that would mean that we might have ended up with a solution that was not the best of all feasible worlds.
Brian Arthur has found that economies, both national and international, operate rather like pareback sand piles. An economic system builds towards a stable state. But to maintain that state, there are frequent major disturbances, financial avalanches. The system is finely balanced on the edge of chaos. Anti-chaos opens a window of order onto the seeming chaos of the stock market and makes it possible to build computer models of the way the market works.
We've designed a system that predicts the behavior of financial markets. Works on a pretty simple principle. We go back through the historical record of financial data and we look for patterns in price movements and other factors that relate to economic markets. And we do a lot of tests to see whether those patterns reproduce. That is, do the patterns happen again and again? And are they statistically significant? And we use those patterns when they occur to predict markets. We get data feeds from all over the world, and our computers are looking at those data feeds all the time. They're looking for certain patterns. A certain set of prices goes up, a certain other set of prices goes down. The computer makes a prediction about what the markets are going to do, and it does a computation to figure out what we should buy and what we should sell in order to make the most money based on those predictions.
This is a day order for Account Prediction Company, July 50, September 92. IMM British Pound Futures at market.
Just checking the British pound, stay with me. What's the British pound?
The mathematical tools that we were using developed out of the quest for finding order in chaos and for using that order to make better predictions. Even though chaotic systems are unpredictable over the long term, they're more predictable than traditional random processes over the short term. And we cut our teeth, as it were, analyzing systems that we knew were chaotic. It's not clear that that's really pertinent to the markets, but on the other hand, the techniques do seem to give us better predictive power. That doesn't mean the markets are really simple chaotic systems, but it does mean these techniques have value.
So far, the trading is not real. The system is on trial and the money made is hypothetical. But the ideas seem to work.
20 at 4.
The success of our computer system would put us at the top of performance of people who are trading out in the real market. It's always a bit difficult because when you pick the winners retrospectively, you're picking out what might have just been somebody who got lucky. It's easy, if you take 5 years worth of trading, there's always going to be somebody that's had a run of good luck. But our results put us up near the top of that heap.
Understand economies? Make a fortune in stocks and shares? Can anti-chaos also save the planet? Here in the Arizona desert, the ecosystem is delicately balanced. Tom Vallone is studying a plot of land which has been subjected to an unusual experiment for the last 15 years. Typically, the landscape is dominated by drought-resistant shrubs and thin vegetation. At the start of the study, several large square plots of land were fenced off. A single rodent, the kangaroo rat, was removed from these areas and kept out by a system of gates, which let all the other native creatures roam freely. 15 years later, these plots of desert land have been dramatically transformed.
On the plots where we excluded kangaroo rats, 2 species of grass increased dramatically. One species increased 10-fold, the second species increased 3-fold.
The results were completely unexpected.
When we first excluded the kangaroo rats, I don't think we would have been able to predict that the vegetation itself would change within those plots. We made simple predictions about the response of other granivores like the ants, but at that time, 15 years ago, we had no idea that the removal of kangaroo rats would change the vegetation type on those plots.
Because ecosystems are so complex and sit just on the junction between chaos and anti-chaos, a small perturbation in the system, like adding 1 grain of sand to a sand pile, can set off an avalanche of change. What happens has proved almost impossible to predict. But anti-chaos is taking us closer to understanding these sorts of complex phenomena. And being able to predict is just the first part of man's ultimate ambition. To understand means to control. At first, heavier-than-air flight was a dream. Early attempts at flying vehicles imitated birds and were spectacularly unsuccessful. Then scientists discovered the principles behind aerodynamics. By applying them, we now have aircraft that can carry us aloft in great comfort, in extraordinary ways, or at high speed. Relatively simple systems such as the dynamics of flight, which are basically linear, respond well to our attempts at control. Complex non-linear systems have so far proved unconquerable. We understand, for instance, how rain clouds are formed and why rain falls. For the last 30 to 40 years, scientists have attempted to make rain. They've flown over drought-ridden areas, sowing chemical seeds into the air to try and persuade water vapor to become rain. But they've utterly failed to make nature bend to their will. Yet we are now a long way from blind belief in supernatural forces which controlled the chaotic world on a whim. Science has given us a way to understand a universe which obeys simple laws. But in doing so, we seem to have lost sight of the complexity and unity of the world around us. Now anti-chaos may be leading us to the next stage, understanding how complex patterns arise, which would mean being able to explain why technologically advanced societies evolve, then die out. It might even mean that we're on the point of realizing the dreams of scientists, to understand finally the laws that govern nature.
Next Sunday at 7 o'clock, Equinox updates its investigation into the strange phenomenon of crop circles.